Now, David, the popular misconception is that the 1967 referendum was about including Indigenous people in the census. Some people even think it also gave Indigenous people a vote. That's clearly not correct. The referendum did two things. What were they?
It did two things. It firstly did away with, repealed Section 127, and that was the section which said that the Aboriginal natives, by that they meant what they then described as full-blood Aboriginals. They were not to be counted for the purpose of the Constitution. This was for the purpose of determining the number of seats that each state would be entitled to have in the Parliament. It was obviously going to be difficult to count Aboriginal people because most at that time were nomadic. And there was a difficulty in really knowing how many there were. There were also fears that they might be used, their votes might be used by graziers who were employing them on a part-time basis, a casual basis, and that they would use their votes. There was a fear about that. So it was decided not to count them, if they were full-blooded, for the purposes of the Commonwealth. It had nothing to do with the census. The census continued. The censuses of the Aboriginal people were continued by the states, and they were most meticulous. It is completely wrong to assume that. The second one was to change the race power, which is they're called placetums, in placetum 26. And that is the power of the Commonwealth to make laws with respect to any race. That's not a racist provision in the sense that it's understood today. By race, they didn't mean only those who weren't European. By race, they could have included, for example, Germans, if they so wished, if they wished to make a special law in relation to a particular race. Now, that provision excluded laws with respect to the Aboriginal people. And the reason was the Constitution was really a framework of how the country should federate. Certain powers would belong to the Commonwealth, to the central government, and other powers would be primarily exercised by the states. They'd be reserved to the states.
Okay, can we just backpedal a little to the misunderstanding about the census? I think the phrase they used was the reckoning of the population, and that, let's just to be clear about this, that was to clarify how many people were living in electorates and how many seats there would be in the federal parliament as a result. Is that correct?
That's right. The Constitution provided that you determined the number of seats each state would have from the size of the population. They could have done it from the size of the people who could actually elect, those who were on the rolls, but they didn't. They did it from the number of people in each state. And there were debates about how many people there were in each state, how many Aboriginal people. Their estimates at the time said that the largest number of Aboriginal people were actually in South Australia. And South Australia was the most liberal in relation to voting. Not only could the Aboriginal people vote in that state, but also women, Aboriginal women, could vote in that state, whereas white women, for example, couldn't vote in Victoria or New South Wales.